panelists today include Ashok Gupta, who's the Senior Pension Economist at IPC, Kayla Messamore, who's the Senior Director of Long-Term Planning at Energy, and Anna Sumter, the Principal at Energy Futures. Anna will be joining us virtually, and so we'll be testing out our people in person and online together at the same time. So no pressure to show. It's all on your shoulders, whether it's success or failure. So with that, if Ashok and Kayla would mind coming up, with the Q&A, I'm going to have a discussion, a Q&A. I will come around with the microphone to assure people online happy to hear your question. If you wouldn't mind, just raise your hand. There you go.
All right, testing.
Thank you, Josh. We're going to have a conversation about resource planning, adequacy, cost down, reliability. On the topic here, that's the rest of the day. We're talking about storage or for the feds or the local government work. I mean, they're going to get a lot more detail later on, which is why this conversation will hopefully set the stage for that. We have two brilliant, excellent friends and colleagues here. Do we see Anna's going to be up there at some point? I guess once you start speaking. So Kayla's with Energy, Anna's with the Energy Future Group. They were both very involved. Kayla led the effort, of course, with Energy on resource planning and IoT. We'll talk about those terms. And Anna was a expert consultant, very involved, and can talk to some of the specific issues. So when we talk about utilities and transition, which is what the title of this is, we're today talking about specific electric utilities. And we're talking about energy in particular as a case study of an example of electric utility. We're not going to touch on other utilities. Every utility is very different in terms of what they do and how they do it. I'm sure the question and answer, we can talk about some of that, but we'll zero in on energy and looking at the transition issue. So my first question to Kayla is really about generation, because we know we like utilities like the generation, transmission, distribution, and what goes on the customer side, specifically focused on generation and the long-term trends. I mean, what has happened over the last 20 years, and big picture, the next 20 years, what do they look like? And of course, your net zero 2045 goal is 25 years approximately. So just give us a lay in terms of what has happened and how the company has been transitioning all along, and how, given the nature of capital investments, these are long-term investments, takes a lot of planning, and that's what planning is done. They go in terms of the last 20 years, next 20 years.
All right, I will try to cover 40 years in approximately 45 seconds. But so from the historical perspective, what you've seen is a pretty significant amount of transition that's happened already for Evergy in particular. I think we've retired about 2,500 megawatts of fossil generation in the last 15, 20 years, and then an addition of about 4,000 megawatts of wind. So that's a pretty significant transition in and of itself. I think most people are focused on kind of here to 2050, but it's important to remember kind of what's happened in the last 20 years as well. So that has been a pretty significant transition already, which brings us to the point where we have this fleet that is very significant wind portion of the fleet, but also still some remaining coal and gas and oil units as well. So our 20-year plan going forward is where you start looking at the rest of the coal fleet in terms of the transition. So we have almost all of our units planned to retire in the next 20 years. Like your show said, the 2045 net zero commitment is kind of the goal out there of getting to net zero by that point. And that's supported by first an investment in even more renewables with kind of a shift towards solar instead of wind. Solar to sort of balance out what wind is able to provide. I think that's another 4,000 megawatts roughly of solar and wind in the next 20 years. And then we have something in our IRP, if you look at it, that's from dispatchable resources. It's another few thousand megawatts of what we've modeled as natural gas fired combustion turbines, with an assumption that they will be not emitting by the time we get to 2036 to 2040. So that's a real big kind of factor in our resource plan, is that the renewable technologies alone are not enough to meet the capacity need. So we've invested in renewables and plan to invest in renewables. But once we get to those last few thousand megawatts, you run into your need for something that is truly firm and dispatchable. So whether that's carbon capture or long duration storage or nuclear or hydrogen, whatever it could be. I'm sure people get annoyed because I list all of those things because I don't know which one it will be. But that's where you run into that, is kind of the last 20%-ish of carbon emissions that need to be offset by something a little more firm. So that's a lot. Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I think what that shows you is really, electricity has been a very diverse portfolio of resources. I mean, it started with a lot of hydro and a lot of coal. We added a lot of natural gas and wind in the last 10 to 20 years, and we'll be adding a lot more solar. And so there's been a transition going on in terms of the power sector for a long time. And there are various factors drive it in terms of technology and cost and emissions. So it is a long-term trend on the generation side that you're seeing. But I'm going to ask Anna to look at the other half of the equation. This somebody told me if you look on supply and not demand, you're kind of clap with one hand. So let's talk about demand for a little bit, because all IRP and resource planning start with a demand forecast. And demand forecast both in terms of total demand, capacity, energy, what time of peak demand, and so on. So Anna, if you can hear me somewhere, can you talk to me about the demand side of the IRP construct and how important it is and how it will change over time, especially with electric vehicles, and how can we better manage peak demand as a way to do a better job with our resource plan?
Sure. So maybe I'll start with just kind of a brief background. This is a definition of IRP that I like to share when I'm giving presentations or writing comments. An IRP is intended to provide a forum for regulators, electric utilities, and industry stakeholders to evaluate the economic, environmental, and societal benefits of different investment options and to facilitate a discussion on future goals, challenges, business strategies. And I think we oftentimes think about supply side resources as the predominant area of interest or area of topic in IRPs, but demand side can provide significant benefits. And there are certain ways in which we actually don't even quantify all the benefits that demand side options can give us. What we normally see in IRPs is an assessment of the potential for demand side management savings. So this would come in the form of energy efficiency programs, which would be things like incentivizing the purchase of efficient appliances, incentivizing weatherization, incentivizing efficiency improvements in industrial processes, as well as incentivizing demand response. So you take sort of almost like a supply curve of those options, and you evaluate that against your supply side options, your natural gas resources, wind, solar storage, et cetera. And historically, that wasn't the case. That wasn't how we treated DSM. We just sort of thought of it as something that happens naturally, or something that doesn't provide a significant amount of benefit. But I think we're starting to realize how important this piece is to the puzzle that we're trying to solve, and that puzzle being supply of reliable energy. You folks lived through Winter Storm Uri, so you are keenly aware of what happens when load goes up dramatically. And for the same reason that load increases during severe events, the impacts of energy efficiency also increase. And so there's a significant reliability benefit associated with DSM that we oftentimes are incapable of quantifying. So it fits into this puzzle of reliability, resource adequacy, as well as transition, in a way that we're just starting to conceptualize and figure out how to quantify.
Thanks, Anna. For those of you, IRP and integrated resource planning really came about initially about 40 years ago when I started working on it as a way to look at demand side resources on par with supply side resources. This is when there were hundreds of nuclear plants on the drawing boards, and the question was, what was going to be a lower cost option for meeting customer needs, and why not look at what's going on the customer side? And DSM and energy efficiency were born as a way to deal with. And so integrated resource planning was always about integrating all the different resource options, including demand side resources. And I think on the supply side, clearly, we know what the options were, and utilities were always doing planning to meet reliability needs and resource adequacy needs. The question was, when you look at a 20-year plan, how do you account for all the different options and keep looking at your plan over time, right? And so my next question to Kayla is really, we talked about 20 years and 25 years. Just let's talk more about the next 5 years and 10 years, because that is a better crystal ball than 15 and 20 years. So what's the company going to be investing in the next 5 to 10 years? And, in theory, you have a capital plan, you're going to be investing, if you had $1 billion to invest, what would that $1 billion go to in terms of O&M, wind, solar, efficiency? What does the portfolio look like for investments in the next 5, 10 years? And for my own purposes, I just looked up your annual revenues are around $5 billion a year. So just give people context of what a $1 billion investment, is in the context of $5 billion in revenues every year looks like. And so next 5 years, 10 years, what does it look like?
Sure. So I won't do any real math, because that's a recipe for disaster for me to try and do math while sitting up here. But the main portions of the investment would be kind of continuing investment in our DSM programs. That's a huge part of our portfolio, and both in Missouri and then working through that on the Kansas side as well. So that's always a big portion of our plan. And then on the renewables side, we still have kind of a mix of wind and solar planned in the next 5 years. The solar is still kind of working through that. It's not quite as mature as wind, so takes a little longer to get that done. But really, over the next 5 years, I'd say it's kind of let's say 60-40 split wind and solar off the top of my head, and then the continued investment in DSM. But I have long-term planning for T&D also, so I'll say that's super, super critical to do as well. That's the other side of all of this, is that you have to prepare the grid to enable the adoption of electrification and behind the meter resources, so that those can be valuable parts of your portfolio down the road. So that's a really big part of our focus, is on the grid side. Everywhere.
Does storage fit in?
Yeah, storage fits in at all levels of this. So for those of y'all who don't know, so my team does IRPs, it does TND planning, and it does ops technology, which is our distribution automation team, among other things. So I'd say we talk about storage at every single level of that. Behind the meter, it can provide valuable demand response type functions, but it can also provide frequency response. It can provide voltage support, all of these things at the individual house level. We're starting to explore uses on the transmission system, whether for economic or reliability purposes. And down the road, you'll see it show up as a supply side resource, a true kind of capacity resource. To date, it hasn't been economic, but I think we expect it to be in the future, particularly as you start seeing longer durations. That's what we're hoping to see, is longer than 4-hour durations that will provide more reliability benefits.
Thanks. Anna, you spent a lot of time looking at Evergy's preferred plan and plan. Can you talk a little bit about how and what an accelerated transition looks like? If we wanted to go to cleaner resources, less expensive resources, what would an accelerated transition look like? And what are the key barriers to that acceleration in terms of, is it transmission? Is it storage? Is it the Southwest Power Pool? I mean, what are the barriers to accelerating the transition that provides real benefits to consumers and, of course, lower emissions at the same time?
I think an accelerated transition looks similar to what Kayla just laid out, but more. And that's essentially the two sides of the coin that we ended up in the IRP. The barriers, I would say, change pretty rapidly and dramatically in this day and age. Initially it was that costs were so low for energy products of all different kinds. In fact, we saw in some instances that energy efficiency for harder to reach customers, like low-income customers, was being priced out relative to other options because the prices of supply-side resources almost across the board had dropped so dramatically. That has changed dramatically in the last year or so. We have fuel, both gas and coal prices at levels that they haven't been in years. Power prices have increased dramatically. The price of PPAs for wind and solar have also increased. I think that the challenge is sort of how do you decide to make long-term decisions when all of these factors change so frequently? And that's really, there's no good solution to that besides having a crystal ball, and I certainly don't have one. Maybe Kayla does, but I certainly don't have one. So it's I think the way that analytical folks like us sort of approach this is to go back to our modeling and say, if we change these input assumptions, what does that tell us about how to change our expansion plan, and what are the levers that we can pull on in the near term that will help us make sure that we have reliable and affordable energy. I mean, should we be doing even more demand response and even more energy efficiency now because of concerns around energy affordability and price increases on the supply side? So the challenge is just that the landscape changes, quickly and in ways that we don't always anticipate, and we don't want to be sort of caught in a place where you don't have optionality to modify our decisions and to think more deeply about where dollars get invested and how to make sure that our supply of energy is reliable and sufficient.
I have to ask you, of course, what role can securitization play in accelerating the transition, and explain securitization?
I feel like I should have you explain securitization. I think you're probably in the best position to do that. essentially securitization is taking the unrecovered plant balance and turning it into a debt-related instrument, so that you can reduce the carrying charge of that balance, that outstanding balance to ratepayers, and then invest the savings into other measures that can help reduce system cost, like energy efficiency. So that to the extent that can help leverage those lower cost measures, and that certainly has a role to play. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Ashok.
No, I mean, I think in a very simple way, if you have more expensive resources and you want to be able to move to less expensive resources, and you have unrecovered balances and not fully depreciated plants, it helps you make that transition. So it was used 20 some years ago when utility industry was deregulated, when people all wanted to go do combined cycle gas plants, and now people look at lower cost renewables and say, why can't we make the transition faster? So it's just another tool in the toolbox to help make this transition happen. So that's why some of us were working on it. Related to that, but also just moving in terms of, for the company, on carbon emission, the forcing function, I mean, there's no federal requirement on carbon. There's no state requirement on carbon. The planning assumes different levels of carbon pricing, and the utility investments include, in effect, shadow carbon pricing, because you have to, otherwise long-term investments wouldn't work out the way you want in terms of managing risk. So talk a little bit about where the motivation in terms of a portfolio and risk management and what your investors are looking for, and mostly talk about investors. We don't always talk about investors, but I think along with resource planning, the company has to pay attention to access to capital, the cost of capital, and how to respond to investor needs at the same time. So that piece of the puzzle around what investors are looking for, because I see in our case here, it's investors that are really important in terms of shaping the company's environmental agenda, not just compliance with the Clean Air Act.
Yeah, it's always a balance, obviously. So what we're trying to do is understand the investor perspective and what is needed to maintain access to affordable capital and be an attractive investment target. So we see it on both the debt and equity investor side of the house, just a continued focus on what's your coal exposure or what's your fossil exposure, what are you investing in renewables, for example. So it's a continuing conversation with investors. Another area that we've seen it is in the insurance market, where there's a continued focus on fossil exposure and being able to get affordable insurance and across our operations. So for all of those, it's a thing that we need to focus on and understand the impacts. We look at the carbon tax or carbon price in the IRP as a proxy for that focus, whether it is a true carbon tax on our operations or it's just something forcing us in that direction. Regardless, it has the same effect. So those are the things we look at, but still in the IRP, our primary objective function is minimizing net present value of revenue requirements. So that's what we look at. And carbon price allows us to proxy and that investor or capital markets view as well to that.
But Anna, can you talk a little bit about the role that the Southwest Power Pool and regional transmission organizations play in helping to constrain or resource adequacy decisions, reliability decisions, and getting credit for wind and solar in the marketplace? And so Evergy doesn't operate in isolation, obviously, and when they have to do their resource planning and make decisions, what the Southwest Power Pool says has a lot of impact, and not everybody probably is focused on
Sure, yeah. I think historically we've thought of organized wholesale markets like RTOs as being really operational entities, entities that are focused on optimization of the dispatch of the power plants that we do have in the ground. And increasingly there is a planning related focus. It's sort of unsaid in some jurisdictions. And the reason for that is because the entities like SPP will create what's called a planning reserve margin, which is essentially a requirement that any market participant has a buffer of extra capacity in case peak load needs exceed where they might be forecasted or projected. And it's not that SPP is performing planning functions, it's just that it's giving a, essentially a reliability metric to the market participants that they need to comply with. And SPP approaches that in many ways similar to how we see other RTOs and organized wholesale markets approach that question. They do a study and they develop this planning reserve margin, and they say, okay, this is the planning reserve margin that all of you utilities shall use in your planning exercises. And increasingly we realize that the analytics behind that exercise may not be capturing the fact that no capacity, whether it's wind, solar, coal, natural gas, that no capacity is perfect, and may not be capturing some of the extreme events that we've seen contribute to things like loss of or a lack of ability to serve load. So there's a real, I guess, introspection, if you will, going on amongst modelers, amongst planners, utilities, these wholesale market entities, trying to think more deeply about how do we approach these questions so that we can ensure that we have reliability. And unless the individual states in SPP decide to step in and create their own metrics, which they're allowed to do under NERC rules, I think a lot of this is still going to be coming from the top down from SPP. So that it has a real impact on the signals that we send to the resource planners about what resources provide what type of value, what type of reliability, and how should we measure that in these plans where we're trying to develop portfolio of resources that we're going to acquire or retire for the next 20 years. So it's a significant factor, certainly.
Do you want to add in transmission into that conversation and talk about what's happening in transmission, what needs to happen, both with FERC and SPP, and given that that's a huge part of this equation too, and we don't talk about it enough, but what do you want to say about transmission? And I have a follow-up about hydrogen, but let's go to transmission first.
All right. Well, there's probably a transmission question or issue at two different scales to simplify. So if you're looking just within the SPP region, you're starting to see transmission, well, we'll just say, as a renewable resource gets into the generation interconnect queue, the first issue is that the queue is 4 years, 5 years, 6 years behind, depending on who you ask. So there's a huge backlog in the ability to interconnect to the transmission system. That's compounded by the fact that now, in kind of recent clusters in SPP terms, you've seen interconnection requests trip huge upgrade assignments. And so they're seeing very large interconnect costs just to interconnect to a system, which is causing SPP to have to look at different ways of studying. How do you think about transmission upgrades that provide value to a generation interconnect customer, but also to load? How do you share costs across these projects? So it's a very exciting time in transmission. And then you look kind of beyond the SPP world. If we have this ginormous technical term, wind resource, and not a huge load. So how do you think about taking it out of the region at scale to the places that want it. So those are kind of the two sides of transmission. When you have large wind resource, relatively small load, you're going to see congestion, price separation between the wind resource and the load, which then hurts the economics of the wind resource. So it's a very complicated problem at multiple levels, but that's my high-level summary of transmission.
The flip side, if you want to get all this renewables out, you need transmission. So Kansas, it's all this wind. How do you get the wind out? Why not just solve our long duration storage problem by using the wind to create hydrogen and attract industry to Kansas and Missouri and use the hydrogen rather than worry about transmission?
So I hope we can. A lot of water required is one kind of physical constraint, is water supply. And so that's when you think about electrolysis, making sure that you have an adequate water supply is important. And then the other side is, do you leave it as hydrogen, in which case do you burn it in a turbine at the wind site, for example, in which case you really haven't solved your distance from load problem? Or another option that we like to spend a lot of time thinking about is, do you turn it into ammonia, which is a little more stable, that's easier to transport, you could take it somewhere, you could sell it as ammonia. So all of those are kind of questions on the hydrogen side, but it definitely has potential. There's a lot of ways that we could use hydrogen given our resources, but we'll just kind of run into the water issue up front and then the storage or transport issue in the midstream.
We're just scratching the surface here. But I wanted to introduce a lot of different topics that are out there, and that's why that question it's all in the conversation that's happening for the next 10, 20 years time frame, and a lot of federal dollars and policies in this arena. So reason for raising these issues. Simple way right now is to really put on the table all the different topics that are in play. Anna, going back, you mentioned PPAs and power purchase agreements. A little bit more on the business model question in terms of what utilities are encouraged and not encouraged based on different states being deregulated on generation or not, and also touch on the whole idea of making money as a utility. The more you invest, the more you make, versus performance-based regulation and all the topics related to PPR and decoupling. So a lot of concepts out there on the business model, regulatory side of things that could make things much better, but we're kind of stuck in the world we're in on the regulation side. So just get a few minutes to talk about your vision of a different business model.
So I think I caught the questions related to performance-based rate making and decoupling, but I didn't catch it as it relates to PPAs. Can you say that again, Ashok?
Yeah, on PPAs, mostly just we know the utility's interest in wanting to own the renewable resource versus buying it, right? So that's always a conversation, and it goes to the tax credits and how tax credits get monetized and so on.
Yeah, that's I'll try to keep that high level. Essentially, the issue is that for solar and for battery storage coupled with solar, you can get a federal investment tax credit. It's called the ITC. That if quote unquote monetized, immediately reduces the capital cost of your investment by as much as 26%. And that's a significant discount, but the problem is that you have to have federal income tax liability in order to capitalize on that credit. And for a variety of reasons, that often is not the case for IOUs, for electric utilities. And so the question becomes, how do you take advantage of that? Can you, do so through a tax equity partnership, for example, so that you can capture the majority of the benefits of the ITC? And that's been done. Tax equity partnerships are certainly the way that independent solar developers tend to capture the ITC benefits. And so they will oftentimes have levelized prices for utility scale solar that are lower than the utility can offer for an owned resource. So there are a lot of questions about how do you make the ITC more widely available? Is there a way for it to be direct instead of sort of indirect through these tax equity partnerships? Some of those things are being explored at the federal level and some of them are not. But they certainly have a big impact on things like whether ownership of renewables makes sense or not. On the flip side, Kayla talked about the interconnection issues, and for utility that's closing a existing thermal resource, you can reuse those injection rights to interconnect something new, like solar or like battery storage. And so, but you can only do so if you own the resource, if the utility owns the resource. So there are a lot of trade-offs around ownership that are sort of tricky to work out and are sometimes site-specific. On the question of decoupling and performance-based rate making, I guess my feeling is that yes, it is a problem that our regulatory system is, very broadly set up so that there is a strong incentive to sell more energy. That is how utilities primarily make money, is by selling more, because there are a lot of costs associated with, producing more energy, both costs that we internalize through rates, as well as the externalities that are imposed by producing energy. But I think there's a lot of complications in any of the tools that we have available to us to fix that issue. One is that we have to find some other way to measure utilities' performance. What are are there other ways that we can say that we think that these utilities have been given, in most cases, an exclusive franchise to provide energy to customers, are discharging those duties in an effective, reliable, safe, cost-effective way, et cetera. And it really takes significant involvement on the part of the regulators and I think significant interest in exploring those topics to create a mechanism that doesn't just sort of shift the way in which we compensate utilities to something that's more complicated and not necessarily more nuanced or more effective. Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that. It's a complicated topic, a very complex topic.
Well, that's why we only gave you 2 minutes, right? So
we'll go to questions in a minute, so think of questions. But in the meantime, Kayla, anything that I didn't ask or anything Anna said that you want to react to or respond to, and or just even generally want to make sure the folks here understand, why you do what you do.
Yeah, and this topic is top of mind because it seems to be all we talk about. But Anna mentioned resource adequacy, and you did too. That's a huge area of focus. Is how do you think about ensuring you have sufficient capacity, but also energy. And so speaking from the SPP side, I mean, there's a lot of things that are being evaluated for potential changes. There's an increasing focus on winter, obviously, which it creates challenges for things like solar or things like natural gas, even that really kind of changes the equation when you look at winter as well. And so that's the main thing that I think we're focusing on is how do we work with SPP as they make changes to resource adequacy requirements to make sure that we are continuing to provide reliable service as we transition the fleet. And a lot of that depends on new from dispatchable technology, because when you think about winter, the sun's not usually shining. And if it is, there's snow on your solar panels. So that can become a problem. Or if your battery is only 4 hours, that's not going to work through a full winter day. So that's a big area of focus for us, and kind of a big driver of our current transition plan. So I just wanted to hit on that because it's very important and very complicated.
Therefore, reducing peaks through energy efficiency becomes even more important.
Yes, and I set you up for that.
Good. Yeah, I mean, to me, when you're dealing with winter reliability issues, what happens, you know, the fact that people's homes are super leaky at peak times. So they're being uncomfortable, they're paying a lot, the system is not going to be as reliable because of those peaks. So to me, as an advocate of energy efficiency, there's nothing more important to address all of those concerns around affordability, reliability, and comfort and low income equity issues than, and not just talking about energy efficiency, but just talking about building up a lot of improvements. Even that contributes to the summer and other peaks in significant ways. And that's why we're working on building energy exchange here in St. Louis to really focus in on buildings as a really key part of system reliability, not just because it's good to do. Let's move to questions. And Josh has the mic, so if you have a question, raise your hand. And go in front.
Hi, good morning. I know that Evergy is required to file an annual update for their integrated resource plan every year. And so I think one's coming up here pretty soon. And I believe you're transitioning to a new model for modeling the demand and generation side of things. So just wondering how that transition is going, any difficulties and benefits that you're seeing, and kind of what the timing is for the annual update.
Sure. So yeah, our annual update, I believe the workshop will be July 1st. So the filing will be in early June, around June 10th-ish of this year. And so like Andrew said, we did transition to a new modeling software this year called Plexos, which is, I won't get into all the details, but its capacity expansion model is fundamentally what it is. And so that's something that the industry as a whole has been kind of expanding into and learning more about this capacity expansion. And the modeling tools have improved significantly. However, no model is magic or perfect. So there's still a lot of improvements that can be made, both in our modeling and in just the modeling space overall to make sure that it's capturing storage effectively. A lot of models do that to varying levels of success, and we're not looking at storage in this annual update, so we have a little time to kind of explore that in more detail. But I would say capacity expansion is great. It's basically an optimization tool given a set of future scenarios, create the lowest cost plan, which is great. But it does force you to really understand kind of what futures are you feeding the model, because that will directly impact what it gives you. And it's important not to be kind of too shaped by what you expect today. You're very, very wrong about something. So it's important to kind of use a wide variety of scenarios to look at sensitivities and use the capacity expansion as a decision-making tool, but not an easy button, because it's not that.
I'm going to do a quick follow-up for Anna on that one. Anna, you do a lot of resource planning work around the country. You've now participated in the Missouri-Kansas effort. Can you just, at a high level, offer some thoughts on the process that we engage in here versus what you see in other states in terms of the role of the stakeholders and the role of regulators?
Sure. So there's some ways in which the process that we participated in is really similar to other jurisdictions. There was a series of stakeholder meetings that were held in advance of the IRP filing, and then stakeholders got an opportunity to ask discovery questions about the IRP and to provide comments. And that's all fairly standard for the jurisdictions in which we work. One of the things that we see increasingly, though, which I think kind of helps the commission, adjudicate a smaller set of disagreements and to have a more robust record, is that the workshops are used to, these pre-IRP filing workshops are used to really dive deeply into the methodology. So we're not just talking about, results from the modeling exercise, for example. We're talking about what are the ways in which we created the scenarios that influence the portfolios of resources that we're looking at. What are the factors that we're trying to capture in this analysis that are, important or salient for this particular period of time? How are we characterizing, all of our different input assumptions? Where are we getting our costs and performance assumptions from? And then what do we think are the factors that will significantly influence this optimization modeling? So whether it's a particular data source, like the manner in which renewable profiles are characterized, or the model settings or things like that. So it's really kind of a conversation about the sort of high level technical aspects of all of the analyses that go into creating the IRP, rather than a one-way transmission where you come and you say, here's the analysis that we did, tell us what you think. And then on the post-IRP side, we see a variety of approaches by commissions. Some have a full-on litigated case schedule where you have experts submitting testimony and there's cross-examination and a hearing, et cetera. And some just do comments similar to the way that Missouri treats IRPs. But one thing that we've seen a number of regulators do in several states now, most recently in Arizona, is actually requiring the utility to provide a license for the same models that the utility uses to perform its IRP, so that stakeholders can do their own modeling and look at all of the input files and output files that were created by the utility. And I think the reason for that is, the reason that is helpful is because if there's a disagreement that can't be resolved in the IRP stakeholder process, like let's say we're at odds with the utility about the cost of solar, rather than sort of speculating about what that might do to the resource plan, we can actually model that and show how that will influence the resource plan. And so there's a really clear record for the commission to adjudicate, to decide what set of model inputs do we think make sense to create the IRP, and what happens if we look at things a little bit differently. So those are two kind of high level things that come to mind.
Hey, good morning. My name is Stan Rasmussen. I'm with the U.S. Army. I'm director of an environmental and energy office. Ashok started out by asking you to look into the future. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning about utilities contemplating shutting down coal plants and replacing those with packaged nuclear facilities. The benefit being that you maintain jobs, the tax base for the community. You've already got the transmission infrastructure built in. You don't have to build new. I was wondering if Kayla and Anna could just kind of comment on their thoughts about that. Thanks.
Yeah, so small modular reactors are something we look at in most of our IRPs we did in the last triennial, and it's not economic based on the cost assumptions that we have today. However, I do think that it could be part of the solution in the future. There's a project in Wyoming, I believe, that I'm really excited about. It's a very cool project. And so we don't have any large scale kind of pilots or projects going on at this point. but it's something we monitor pretty closely. In particular, if you look at the kind of replacing a coal plant with a small modular reactor, but it's just not something that's mature enough that we've really started to work on yet.
In the short term, for a coal plant like Lawrence, we are actually having a conversation on Thursday to look at storage at that same site. So I think based on when technologies are going to be ready and what their costs are, we need to figure out what a transition plan for some of these coal facilities might look like in terms of both tax base, economic development, and other impacts on communities when you shut something down. So I think that based on really what becomes available when, and as Anna mentioned, being able to keep your interconnection queues at these facilities solves another problem where you don't have to wait 3, 4, 5 years at a new facility to put something in. So using existing facilities and the infrastructure and the interconnection ties becomes a very, very important, valuable tool. And so my hope is in the near term, we can use them for storage, even if it's 4-hour storage, it's better than no storage. And Josh, is there a question or one more? And I'm going to close with one comment. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Lauren Poindexter. I'm recently retired from Ameren. Glad to hear about the nuclear reactors because that's where I spent most of my career. I was wondering more about the topic of grid stability. You kind of touched on infrastructure quite a bit, but with the EV charging predicted to surpass the capacity of the grid about 2028 to 2030, there's going to be a lot of quick changes and making fast adjustments to keep the grid stable. Are you looking at that type of infrastructure changes, possibly regulatory changes, advanced innovative controls versus advanced innovative monitoring?
Yes. So we're continuing to study kind of what we think the EV adoption will look like at a more granular level. That's a big focus for our distribution planning and transmission planning team. But specifically to your question, we're also spending a lot more time thinking about, call it dynamic stability on the transmission side, looking at things like fast voltage recovery of STATCOM, synchronous condensers, all of these technologies that aren't that important when you have a lot of spinning generators on your system. As you replace that with more inverter-based resources and look towards retirements in the future, that dynamic support and the inertia become really, really important. So on the transmission side, that's a focus. And then on the distribution side, it's looking at how can we look at our distribution automation investments and our software that we're deploying to kind of control the system at that level and get much more granular load flow data and have more control. So we're looking at it at all levels again, but it's very complicated, as is everything. So it's fun. It makes it fun.
Thank you, Kayla. Just a quick, on that last point and all the different things we've talked about, we all know with electricity, because mostly we don't store it, we have to generate it and we use it instantaneously. So the whole system is designed to meet that peak demand. I'll keep going back to that. So when you're meeting, so that's a cost. And so anything you can do to shape your demand curve to fill in the valleys with electric vehicles and lower demand peaks, especially through energy efficiency and other demand response solutions, will help lower cost of the whole system and make it better in terms of managing that system. So to me, the demand side of the equation always needs a lot of attention, and electricity, until we get to storage being really a significant part of the mix, which is not easy. So we're doing 4 hours, some long duration, eventually hydrogen. There's just real challenges to the system because of the nature of demand and how it is fluctuating all the time. Some remember light states and so on. And the system has to be able to meet that demand no matter when it shows up. And so to me, if we flatten the demand curve and shape it, and the product effort that, that's kind of where space I find most interesting in. So I include that. And also, of course, thanks to Taylor and Anna, and as I said earlier, and nice
people. So give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. And don't forget, Ashok, you have to give yourself credit as well. Thank you very much for leading that fantastic conversation. Before we start on our next session, which is carbon capture pilot projects, I do want to share a brief message from one of our sponsors, Spencer.
Hi, I'm Amy Davenport,